Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Dom Crossan. And today's discussion is based upon his book titled Paul the Pharisee, A Vision Beyond the Violent Civilization. His book just recently came out. And I'll leave a History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below so you can go get his book. And so that being said, welcome back to the show, Dom.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what your new book is about before I get to my questions?
And let me just pick on that last word, Pharisee. Certainly, Pharisees get a very bad reputation, and I would claim a libelous reputation in the New Testament, because if you talk about the earliest Jews who were what I would call messianic or Christic, not Christian, Christianity hasn't been invented yet, but they're messianic Christic Jews, they're fighting for the center of their people with the Pharisees, who really have staked out the center with maybe the Essenes to the left and the Sadducees to the right. So I want to explore the very meaning of Pharisee beyond the libel, beyond the way we use Pharisaic as an insult or anything else. Paul was a Pharisee. He says it. Luke says it. I want to see what that means. And the book is sort of exploding that like you might the atom into all its conclusions and implications.
When you call him a Pharisee, there are some that would doubt that. Could he really have been a Pharisee? He doesn't seem to act like one. His views are so different from that of a regular, everyday Torah Orthodox Jew of his time.
Yeah.
How could he really be a Pharisee? It doesn't make sense to some people. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it probably didn't make sense to a lot of his fellow Pharisees. That's why he was in such trouble. But also, by the way, the evidence of the New Testament is it didn't make much sense to his later Christians looking at him. They weren't quite sure about him. Maybe Peter was a safer bet. So Paul is a radical. My slogan over there about who's afraid of the big bad Paul, most of the New Testament, yeah, that's not just being funny. Luke spends an awful lot of time in the Acts of the Apostles de-radicalizing and re-Romanizing Paul. So yeah, I don't think he's a liar. I have no evidence for it, so I call nobody a liar unless I have clear evidence. I think he is absolutely sincere. He says he's a Pharisee. He doesn't say he's an ex-Pharisee. He never says anything like that. So I take him very seriously.
Can you talk about what you call the Roman matrix and the Jewish matrix?
Let me explain. I use the word matrix not just to be kind of difficult, but I found people very often when they talk about text and context, or foreground and background, somehow the background and the context disappears into the air somewhere. I want a single word, matrix, which means everything you got to know what's going on. Today in America, everything you got to know to understand the headline. Back in the first century, everything you have to understand to know what's a Pharisee. That's what I mean by matrix.
And before you finish, I just want to correct myself. I meant to ask the Christian matrix and Jewish matrix, but yes, question's the same.
Yes, I think historically we started in a way with what I call a Christian matrix, especially putting Paul back in the Reformation, and Paul against Judaism is kind of like Protestantism against Catholicism, and it's all great fun and mostly bunk. Polemically useful, but not historically valid. So if you're keeping within that Christian matrix, you're going to see the Paul you want. You're going to see yourself. So we say Paul was a Jew. He himself insists he was always a Jew. Now he's a certain type of Jew. And in the first century, there were different types of Jews. That shouldn't, by the way, be news. There's always different types of everything, including Americans. So what type of a Jew was he? And that's what I'm pushing. The key word is to understand him as a Pharisee. But now, the Roman matrix. You can't talk about Judaism in the diaspora or the homeland in the first century as if the Romans weren't there and sort of arrived mysteriously at the last moment. This is Judaism under Romanization, under Roman power, responding to Roman power. So you have to take that Judaism, or that Paul the Jew, put him under Rome. What's his position on Rome? Is he for it? Is he against it? Is he neutral? Does he have anything to say about it, or does he just think it's irrelevant? The point of the book, though, is we have moved along those three matrices. I think right now the consensus of scholarship is to understand Paul's Judaism, Paul the Jew, if you will, inside Roman imperialism. I'm pushing it to say, could we think in terms of big history, evolution? How does Paul look within human evolution? If, for example, somebody wasn't a Christian, wasn't a Jew, couldn't care less about God, Bible, or any of that, is Paul of any validity, or is he just something only of value either to Jews, to who he may annoy, or the Christians whom he may also annoy? How does he look in the public square, as it were?
And what do you call the fourth matrix?
That's my term for evolution. Here's really I have to be personal here. In the first decades of this century, there was a Boer Crossan pilgrimage went every year to Turkey in the footsteps of Paul. And every year, obviously the people who came with us, 30 or 40 people, were interested in Paul, or they wouldn't be with us. But they were there in a last desperate attempt to see if Marcus and I could make some sense of Paul. They didn't like him, to be blunt. So I found myself being defensive, not only about Paul in the first century, before I even got to Paul in the 21st century. Hold on to that. Now, in the last couple of years, I read some European philosophers, the German philosopher Jacob Taubes, and the French philosopher Alain Badiou, the Georgia Agamben from Italy. And all of a sudden, philosophers who were not in the least bit interested in religion or Christianity, or Paul as an apostle maybe, and even defensively against him, kind of pleading, at least for Badiou. And all of a sudden, they're finding Paul relevant to the 21st century. So now, I'm finding my Christians over here that I take to Pauline sites are having trouble finding Paul of any redeeming social influence, let alone relevant. And I'm finding European philosophers. So that kind of came together to say, okay, let me take another look at Paul as if I was talking to infidels or atheists or agnostics or people for whom this isn't the matrix, to try and imagine the matrix as evolution. What does Paul, as a thinker, let's forget him as an apostle, as a thinker, like Plato, for example, does he have anything to say to us today within cosmic evolution, which we all know about? Whether we like it or not, we live in it. We can ignore it, but most of us accept gravity. Whether we're Catholic, Jewish, Hindu, anything, we kind of respect gravity, however we explain it. So that's the fourth matrix, is the evolutionary matrix. How does Paul look? If I'm going to be very blunt, if I could bracket atheism and theism for a moment and say, could we look at Paul from the lens of evolution, cosmic human evolution? How does he look?
What is Paul trying to do? And what is his goal? Like when he converts, claims to have this vision, and my second question to that is, do you see a conflict between Acts and the way it talks about his conversion story and what Paul in his letters tells us? And what does his goal become after he's converted?
Let me talk, first of all, about the easier part of your question. Is there a clash between, let's call it the Pauline Paul, that's the Paul of the 7 authentic letters, and the Paul of the Lucan Paul, the Pauline Paul, the Lucan Paul? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Luke will give everything to Paul except what is most important. Was he an apostle on a par, say, with Peter and the rest? That is, he has seen the Lord. And therefore, of course, if he's not an apostle, he can't be an apostle of the Gentiles. Luke pretty much wipes that out. Now you say, wait a minute, he gives three full accounts of Paul's, of what happens at Damascus. Oh, it couldn't be more important. Yeah, but read it carefully. What you find is Paul is blinded by the light. When you're blinded by the light, you ain't seeing anything. Paul insists, I have seen the Lord. That makes me an apostle. Luke says, no, you haven't seen the Lord. You're a great missionary, terribly important, all the way to Rome. But you're a missionary. You're a second-class disciple. Peter and the 12 have seen the Lord. You haven't. Sorry. That wipes out Paul's authority, his integrity, his identity, gives him what he doesn't give a hoot about. Well, I shouldn't say that maybe, but it wipes out what he lives and dies for. I am an apostle because I've seen the Lord.
And what about Acts and what it talks about his conversion story? Does it give us more reliable information, or does it contradict what Paul says about the circumstances of his conversion?
Absolutely contradicts it. It gives us gorgeous theatrics. Look, nobody in the New Testament can tell a better story than Luke except Jesus. When Luke tells a story, we use the phrase today as a cliche, the Damascus experience, on the road to Damascus. Once Luke tells a story, it's almost impossible not to see it that way. Now, I don't mind Luke giving us this story on the road. It's a great metaphor. You're changing your mind and you're going from place to place and you're struck to the ground. It's a marvelous metaphor. The trouble is the content of the metaphor. Luke, as I said, is denying what Paul lives and dies for, his apostolicity. If everything else was the same, if Paul saw the Lord, but he not only doesn't see him, he doesn't even recognize his voice. Who are you, Lord? He doesn't even get it after they're speaking to one another. This is exactly the opposite to the apostles, who see the Lord not only during his earthly life, of course, but have visions of him after his ascension. So Paul is quietly negated. And furthermore, he's replaced by Peter. Peter is the one who in chapters 10 and 11 has the great revelation and becomes the apostle of the Gentiles. Doesn't get the title. His account of his conversion, if you will. And it's kind of a conversion because he almost argues with God. I don't eat that stuff. Don't you call stuff unclean? So you can almost see it. I mean, I kind of use a conversion there. I don't use that term for Paul so much. So if you read Acts carefully, and you shouldn't do the Bible unless you're reading carefully, look at everything that happens to Paul almost happens earlier to Peter. Peter is the apostle of the Gentiles, without the title granted, in Acts. There's even 3 accounts of it. When it happens in chapter 10, when he tells it in chapter 11, tells it again in chapter 15. And in chapter 15, James almost pays no attention to Paul and Barnabas, but he mentions what happened to Peter and lets Peter tell the story again. So it's not just like what happens on the road to Damascus. The Acts of the Apostles are a careful wipeout, denigration, to use a blunt term, of Paul, to be replaced by Peter.
And what about when Acts tells us other things about Paul's encounters with like Sergius Paulus, John Mark, Elymas Bar Jesus? Is there any historicity to those narratives, or is there reason to doubt what the author of Acts is saying there as well?
Yeah, let me draw back before I reply to that, because there's a preliminary question that any scholar must face. Granted, there is a tension, let's use a neutral term, between the Pauline Paul and the Lucan Paul. How are you going to solve that, dear scholar? Before you begin, Are you simply going to use Luke like a buffet, like this? Take it, don't like that, leave it. Is it a cherry picking operation? How do you decide what to take or leave from Luke? Luke Acts, of course, I mean. Here's what I did in my own case. I took about a year to a year and a half. I forgot. I said, leave Paul aside. Let me focus on Luke, on Acts really mostly, but really on Luke Acts as a whole. Let me try and figure out what Luke Acts is up to. So before I answer any individual question, it's going to be based on that. What is the purpose, function, authorial intention of Luke Acts? Why, first of all, are there 2 volumes? So the first question I had to answer was, is this a book? And then years later, a sequel? Or is it a 2-volume book planned from the beginning like that? You mentioned, for example, Paul in Romans. I see the intention of Luke Acts to show Christians, I'm using that term now, Christians, because I'm thinking the beginning of the 2nd century, how they can be safe within the Roman Empire. It's safe to be a Christian and blunt. In fact, the future belongs not to Jewish Christianity, says Luke, but to Roman Christianity. That's why Paul is heading inevitably westward, and the story ends when you get to Rome. Roman Christianity is the future. That's the theme of Luke Acts. That's why it takes, as it were, 2 big scrolls to do it, where Mark and Matthew and John can write in 1 scroll. So the first thing you have to do is, what's the theme? And that's the theme. The future holy city is Rome, not Jerusalem. And Paul would be screaming, by the way, to hear that. So would Matthew.
So when you look at Sergius Paulus, Elymas Bar Jesus, Simon Magus, John Mark in Acts, do you put any stock in those narratives, or do you think Acts is conjuring up more stories about fictitious encounters that did not exactly occur?
I think the way Luke operates is he has excellent, excellent Pauline information. But he gives it a Lucan, I'm going to use this term, misinterpretation. Let me use a classic example, and I'll get back to the ones you mentioned. Paul tells us of his exit strategy from Damascus, over the wall in the basket. It's unforgettable. Luke has it too. Luke says he did it because the Jews were trying to kill him guarding the gates. Paul says because the Nabateans were trying to arrest him guarding the gates. I go with Paul there. But watch, the event is true. Paul, I think, did come on. It's a great story, but I think it's true. Paul was let out of Damascus through a window in the wall. He ran, in plain language. He fled. I think that happened. Yes, that's an historical event. Now, if you ask who's after him and why is somebody after him, Paul makes absolute sense to me. Aretas IV has just thrust north from Petra and is probably going to take over Damascus. Paul, as a Jew in an Arab country, is in trouble. That makes sense to me. I will take that as historical, as best we can get. The Jews guarding the gates of an Arab city in the 1st century in Damascus to kill Paul? No. That's Lucan thematics, anti-Jewish thematics. So be very careful when you're reading Luke Acts about the Jews. So come back to your example. Do I think Sergius Paulus was the proconsul at Paphos of Cyprus? Yeah, sure. We even got some indirect, granted, evidence for it. Sure. Did Paul meet him? Now I'm getting a little bit questionable, but okay, for the moment, nothing happened. When you read the story, you think, well, did Paul convert him? Or did he simply prefer Paul's version of things to his other resident magician, as it were? Did he think Paul and the other barriers, as you might say, were just, kind of entertainment, court entertainment, not quite court jesters, but court philosophers, if you will. It's plausible. I don't know at that point, but when I read Luke, what I see is the very first authoritative Roman official Paul runs into. He either converts him, which is probably pushing it, I doubt if that's true, but they get on fine. So Paul's all set for Gallio at Corinth, all the way to the end of the book. Every single Roman official who runs into Paul says he's innocent. I do not know anyone who's ever been so innocent. But of course, if I'm a Roman, I'm going to say, I wish he wasn't up before us so often. If he was that innocent, why is he ever up in court all the time? So Luke's apologetics, and it is apologetics, is the Jews are causing trouble all the time. Everywhere you look, the Jews are rioting. The Romans keep saying that Paul is innocent, at least from a Roman point of view. That is the apologetics of Luke Acts at the beginning of the 2nd century. Does it have an historical core? Of course. Is it an historical novel? No, because too much of the history has also changed. It's not that he just keeps his history straight and over here invents a character. No, he has Paul meet Gallio or Sergius Paulus, like you said, or Festus, and they all say he's innocent. And no, that didn't happen. I don't think that happened. If every Roman official finds Paul innocent, what's he doing at the end on a boat going to Rome? You don't send innocent people to the imperial court in Rome, A, because it's too expensive, B, because they're going to ask you, what's the indictment? You're going to say, well, he's innocent, so I just sent him on. That's how to become an ex-Roman governor real fast.
What do you think Paul did when he was at Damascus that caught the attention of King Aretas IV and upset him subsequently into wanting him in custody?
First of all, I think it's quite plausible, as Luke says, we only have his evidence for it, that Paul was born in Tarsus. I do not think that that Paul was educated, as Luke says he was, in Damascus, in Jerusalem, sorry, because he says when he went to Jerusalem, nobody knew him there. He went there after his, let's call it his conversion or his revelation. I think he went to Damascus. I think he studied in Damascus. He was in Damascus. I think of him as sort of like the Orthodox enforcer in one of the Damascus synagogues. That's what he was doing, I think. So he is in Damascus. Now, forget Paul for a minute. Think of the two sides of the Jordan, the 1st century. On the west, you have it divided up, as we know so well, between the Herodian princes, Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. We know that. Over on the other side of the Jordan, the Nabateans now have a powerful king, Aretas IV. Probably, well, you might have debate whether Aretas III, who conquered Damascus, might be greater, but he's as good as they've got in 100 years. And the best they're going to have for 40 years. He's going to be a long, long ruler. His hope plan is to thrust north. He wants to get Damascus, like Aretas III did, and printed and had coins made there. When's his chance? Philip, the Tetrarch, who claimed, as you remember, the northwest quadrant east of the Sea of Galilee, died 34, I think. Aretas makes his move. He pushes north. We know from Josephus that he was fighting with Antipas around Gamla. Wow, that's way, way far north. He's almost at Damascus. What's he doing in Gamla? I think the only thing that makes sense of him, he's grabbing Philip's territories and pushing for Damascus. Probably hopes the Romans will allow him to be a buffer state on a Damascus-Petra axis between them and the Parthians. Besides, Tiberius is just about dying, so maybe he'll get away with it. It all makes historical sense. Now, This is a time when Paul is a missionary among the Nabateans, a Jewish missionary in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong reason. Aretas is coming north. Maybe Paul has been using Damascus. So now he's trapped. He has to get out of it. It's not a good time to be a high-profile Jew in an Arab country, the Nabateans. All of that, at least, is absolutely historically plausible. Even if you were making it up, at least it would be a good historical novel. In other words, the history is right in a way that the history is not right when the Jews are guarding the gates. So Luke is more apologetical history than an historical novel. He's not interested in, he's interested in apologetics at the beginning of the 2nd century when we're just beginning to get philosophical apologetics like Justin Martyr. Now we're getting a brilliant narrative apologetics. Wow, over against the Roman story, you guys are followers of a crucified rebel, comes this perfect storm of innocence. Wow, if I was a Roman, I don't think I'd swallow it, by the way, but I'd read it and I would recognize that they're claiming us guys are really, really good guys. Jews are causing trouble. Romans find us innocent. It's magnificent apologetics. It just is not history.
So how does Paul view Jesus?
This is the core question. And to understand Paul, let me just imagine, trying to put myself in the mind of Paul for a moment. I don't know what verb. Oh, let me put it this way. We know that Paul says in 2 Corinthians that one time he had an ecstatic vision in which he was taken up to heaven, remember? And he doesn't even know whether he was in the flesh or out of the flesh. Ecstasis, that's typical ecstasy. And he said he saw things that he can't even tell. Now, hold on to that. There's one other time Paul talks about the mystery of God, using the term mystery, and says it's an eternal mystery beyond human understanding. I'm going to put those two things together. Here's what astounds, amazes, empowers, any verb you want, Paul. God knew, again, we can choose our verb, whatever we want. God knew, God allowed, God decreed, God, that when the Messiah came to earth, or use Pauline, when God sent the Messiah, when God sent the Messiah to earth, he would be executed publicly, legally, officially, by the greatest empire there ever was, which boasted of its law and order and civilization. That's the heart of Paul. How is that possible? What was God up to? Couldn't God have sent the Messiah a little bit some other time? Why did God, Paul's language would be decree. Why did God do that? And Paul's answer is God wanted to reveal to the world the savage heart of civilization, not just of Rome. As Paul says, the rulers of this world, the archontes, the rulers of this world didn't know what was going on, or else they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Their vacuity, their poverty, their hypocrisy, their savagery was revealed in this. The Messiah came and they executed him. Now, that's the heart of Paul. In one sense, that's what he's trying to probe. That's what God, that's the mystery he calls the mystery of God. That's at the beginning of 1 Corinthians when he talks about this eternal wisdom of God, which contradicts the wisdom of normalcy. And we call it the stupidity of God, and God calls us the because they can't see that the execution. I'm emphasizing that the public legal execution. He wasn't lynched. He wasn't run over by a chariot, runaway chariot. He was not lynched. He was officially executed. That means that either Jesus was guilty, or Rome, which is simply civilization in a toga, is being revealed as bankrupt. That's where Paul starts. And in one sense, that's where he finishes, because then the next question is, okay, granted that we have revealed the core failure of civilization, what else must God reveal? Of course, the resurrection, which raises the issue, is there justice in the world then?
Can you tell us about Philo's view of a new creation that he talks about in his Life of Moses and how that parallels Paul's vision of a new creation?
Yeah, when we read the opening overture, I would call it, of the Bible, we call it Genesis 1. We find that God creates rest and all the rest of it, the Sabbath rest. We tend to kind of, oh, that's nice, you all get a rest. Now, Philo, however, interprets that rest as freedom. He says on the Sabbath, and then the Sabbath year and the Sabbath jubilee, and all of time being regulated by the Sabbath, which otherwise you wouldn't have time in the Jewish sense, years, dates, is about freedom. It's an extraordinary comment. You are free from work. You are free from work. So is your draft animal. So are your draft animals. So are your children. So are your slaves and your servants. But so are the fields and the trees. And Philo says every blade of grass is free because you can't cut it. So what Philo sees as being created with the Sabbath is not just a day off or something like that, but that freedom inundates or inspirates the whole world. The rhythm of time runs to the rhythm of freedom. So that's the view of creation, which you get from a Sabbath view of creation. The very time itself is regulated to the rhythm of justice, of freedom. Paul talks about creation having to be restored in Romans. The creation is groaning. And of course, to be honest with you, the ones that make it groan, sometimes creation makes us groan with typhoons, I suppose, and tornadoes and volcanoes. But most of the time, as Paul sees it, we're making creation groan. What we do to creation. Now, Paul is not even imagining what we were talking about, climate change and all the rest of that. That's not even on the horizon. He's thinking of what war, especially, what violence does to the world. But that's how I would find Paul relevant today, because he's talking in a way about cosmic justice. And that's what we're talking about today. Not just about weapons of mass destruction, but the danger of losing biodiversity, and of course, accelerated, I would emphasize accelerated climate change, which is kind of what we're doing to the world. Paul doesn't see all of that. He just sees the first stage, weapons of mass destruction. It's already there, of course, in Isaiah, when you're beating your swords into plowshares, that they knew about that too.
Can you tell us a bit about Galatians 4:3-7 and Romans 8:14-17? What is noteworthy about those two passages?
What's worthy, especially about them for me, is that Paul is kind of stuck culturally, and he seems to know it. And we are stuck with the translation. In the patriarchal world in which Paul lives, the firstborn son, or the beloved son, or simply the son, is the heir. Now, that's the way it is. It's a sonship is heirship. So you can go to the New Testament afterward. Every time you find the word son, for Jesus as Son of God. Cross out son and put in heir, H-E-I-R. Paul is trying to talk about we are all, this is the extraordinary thing, sons of God. That gets us really annoyed when we're trying to think in terms of female as well as male. So very often we change it to we are all children of God. And that's nice in one sense. But it loses the cultural power. And there's sometimes not in Galatians, but in Romans, Paul will shift from saying we are all sons of God, talking about divine sonship, to divine heirship, using paideia, not huios. Here's what's at stake. In Paul's world, the son was the heir. So if he wants to tell a whole group of people, half of whom are women and half of whom are men, you're all heirs of God, he's liable to say you're all sons of God. It's the only way he can get it across. Now, he seems to be aware of the problem, because in Romans, when he's saying the same thing, he shifts from using the Greek word for son, which is huios, to the Greek word for child, which is paideon, after he has established, of course, that you are heirs. Because to say you're all children of God is very nice, but it's not as powerful as saying you're heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. That is I think, most extraordinary thing Paul says to his recipients of his life. You're co-heirs, not sub-heirs or para-heirs or whatever. You're co-heirs with Christ. So be aware not only of the linguistic problem, but of the cultural problem.
What led Paul to conclude that we need to go to the Gentiles?
Let me get back to resurrection. The Pharisees, let me back up a little bit. In the first century, there was a clear distinction, which we have lost, between ascension, apotheosis in Greek, and resurrection, which is anastasis in Greek. Apotheosis meant that a great individual like Moses within Judaism or Romulus within Rome could be on death taken up to God or the gods. They'd be taken up to heaven. Now, it's very individual. It's about individuals. It's personal. The Pharisees came up with these extraordinary ideas. The ancestors of the Pharisees came up with it around the year 150 BCE. There is such a thing as cosmic justice. This is they're speaking to a world in which people are beginning, the Jews especially, is there any cosmic justice? Okay, it's fine to talk about the justice of God. We had the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks. Now we got the Romans coming. Where's the justice of God? Empires are getting more powerful. Don't tell me about the justice of God when I can't see it anywhere. So the Pharisees insisted there will be justice at the end of time. Yes. Well, at least let's listen to them. There will be justice because at the end of time, every single person that ever lived is going to have to be brought back to life. You're kind of still scratching your head listening. And they will be judged. And there will be a heaven or a hell. Now, that may sound like, come on, you got to be kidding. But supposing you have an empire's boot on your neck and had it there for 500 years, the very idea that there might be justice somewhere in the world, that there might be justice, and maybe it might even be soon, we hope. This is the great Pharisaic vision. There is cosmic justice. Now, we might mock it, say, come on, everyone's coming back to life. What about cannonballs and all the rest of it? Yeah, it's great fun. But it raises the issue, which we have to face today. Is there cosmic justice? What if we are going against evolution? Let me leave out divine punishments and everything else and talk about human consequences. What if we are doing stuff in the world that not that we'll be punished by God for at the end of time, but that we are having consequences every day already? That maybe heaven and hell are not places in the future, but locations in the present. And we're busy populating them as fast as we can. So Paul's Pharisaic vision of a cosmic justice, which for him is at the end of time, which by the way for Paul is coming soon, so it's possible to take it very seriously for him. What if we shifted from divine punishments to human consequences, from resurrection to responsibility, from judgment to accountability? Then it starts to look like the evening news. So that's the relevant challenge of Paul that these philosophers are beginning to see. That's my way of putting it. They mightn't agree with that relevance, but I'm beginning to see if for the moment we speak not of theism or atheism or argue about God, but say, okay, come down to the level of evolution. If you think God exists in classical theism, then that God operates by evolution, whether you like it or not. If you don't think such a God exists, fine, you still have evolution. You still have evolution. The death of God did not excuse us from gravity, for example. And gravity is the glue of the universe, not just what you and I have to think about when we're going down the stairs. So I want to see, back to my fourth matrix, evolution. What if we began to see Paul, for example, or Jesus, of course, but Paul for the moment, in terms of an evolutionary viewpoint? Because remember, Paul says that the resurrection has begun with Jesus. As a Pharisee, he believed in this general resurrection at the end of time. Then as a messianic Christic Pharisee, 1 Corinthians 15, say 20, he argues that the general resurrection, the Jesus resurrection, stand or fall together. He couldn't imagine, can't imagine as a Pharisee that resurrection is some special privilege for Jesus. You could imagine an ascension as a special privilege for Jesus. But that the general resurrection has already begun, whether you believe it or not, I'm asking, what on earth does that mean? Even for Paul to say it. It's like if you and I were to declare today, peace on earth has begun. Our response is, well, could I see exactly where it is showing up? Because I can't quite see it. So Paul is claiming that the cosmic justification, to use my language, of the world is already in process. That's what he means by the resurrection of Jesus. That the other side of the revelation of civilization's hypocrisy, if you will, by killing Jesus, is that God has also revealed that Jesus is resurrected, not just ascended. Paul would not accept simply that Jesus has ascended to God, just like Caesar did to the gods, or even the Caesar didn't and Jesus did. His word is resurrection, and that's a Pharisaic term. Not even a Jewish term, it's a Jewish Pharisaic term. And if you brought it up and tried to explain it to Romans, as Paul did according to Luke at Athens, they would just giggle. They'd just laugh at you. If you said Jesus had ascended, they might get into an argument with you. But if you brought up this resurrection, they would just roll over laughing. So to try and take seriously Paul the Pharisee and the Pharisaic concept of resurrection, and see how it was for Paul as a messianic Pharisee, and its relevance now, if it is, that's what the book is about.
And in my closing question, where did Paul get the idea that Jesus was going to come back? And where did he get the idea that it would be soon? What gave him that indication it would be anytime soon?
I think it honestly was inevitable. I mean, he's coming up with an idea so radical that to try and tell people, he had to kind of believe it. 2,000 years, if Paul's message was this is going to last, get ready for the long haul, it's going to last 2,000 years, I think Paul would have said, oh my, I quit. I quit. It's almost like, if you and I confronted with COVID said, well, get ready for it. It's a 2,000 years thing. It'll be here for 2,000 years. At least we held on to it would be soon. And so we were able to survive it. I think that's the same thing. The Jewish tradition have been saying for hundreds of years, God's great justification of the world is coming soon. The prophets have been saying soon, 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 soon. Now you got Jesus saying this strange announcement, it's here. And Paul saying the same thing. It's already here. I mean, the first reaction to that, honestly, would have been, you guys are nuts. I mean, we've known from all the time that when the Messiah comes, when the Messianic age is here, there'll be peace and everything. Where is it? And the message you're getting from Jesus and Paul is, it's starting only insofar as you people are starting it. Most people say, wait a minute, God's supposed to do it for us. Where does it say in the tradition that we're supposed to do it with God? Come on. We're waiting for God. We're praying for God. We're hoping for God. Only God can do it. You guys are saying we're in it too with God? And you're kind of saying if we don't do it, it won't going to happen? And Paul and Jesus would be in their heads. And now, for them, they can't imagine it. They simply cannot imagine it. Probably Jesus cannot either if you poke them about it. Is it going to happen within our lifetime? Sure. Is it going to happen in your lifetime, Paul? Well, maybe not mine, but certainly ours. I think that's where they get it. Now, the one interesting thing, though, is when Paul describes that consummation, it's a great big party. It's a parousia. Jesus comes in like the emperor comes in to your city for a great big feast, celebration. That's not the picture you get in the book of Revelation, by the way. So even if you're imagining the consummation, and even if you're imagining it as soon, and you're wrong by 2,000 years, it is important whether you're imagining it as a celebration or a cosmic punishment. So Paul does imagine it coming soon, but his word, and only his word, John doesn't use it in Revelation, is parousia. And apanthesis is what you do. Those are the words of celebration when the emperor comes to visit your city and you're having a great big bash, meat for everyone, festival, good time. It's a celebration. So, no, he was wrong, off by 2,000 years. That was coming soon. So was Jesus, if we can know what Jesus said as distinct from what was put in his lips. But if he did, he was wrong too. Everyone so far has been wrong, except there are people out there now who are talking about climate change and soon. And I'm not sure they're wrong. Though I'm not sure that we are capable, to be honest with you, of destroying ourselves, but we're certainly capable of trying.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dom.
Always a pleasure, Jacob. Anytime. I hope people enjoy the book.
And to that end, the link to purchase this book is in the History Valley Amazon affiliate link is in the description below. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.